Welcome to part 2 of my stool adventure. If you missed the first part, I'll leave a link to that video in the description box below. But to briefly cover where we're at so far, it all started with the fact that I just needed a stool. And so I wanted to try and use this basic Ikea one, but it's a very basic looking stool and I wanted it to look more interesting than that. So I wanted to see if it was possible for me to take this stool and see if I could make it look similar to this one that I found on Pinterest that I really liked. So I gave it a go. I covered it in cardboard and then tape, and then joint tape, and then plaster, and then I sanded it, and then I did more plaster, and I sanded it again, and I did that a couple of times. And then I covered it in paint. Then I used coffee pods covered in plaster and paint to create the dome effect on the stool. Now I'm happy with it, don't get me wrong. I actually often stare at it from across the room and admire it. I'm really happy with how it turned out. However, if you watched the original video, you will remember that halfway through during my coffee drinking spree that I had to do in order to collect all of these coffee pods, I had a brainwave about using the boxes of the coffee pods to create the frame around this wood frame, because essentially I wanted the stability of a stool, but I wanted to add these bits around it to create the shape that I wanted. And I couldn't get it out of my head, so of course I had to start trying it. So in the last video, where I left off was in between finishing the original stool, I had started working on the second one. I'd used the coffee pod boxes as legs and then dismantled some of the other boxes as well to create the shape around the top of it as well. I did learn through this process that this was so much easier than the original stool. I think partly because the cardboard is thinner and easier to manage, but also really importantly, if you are thinking about doing a project like this, having the same type of cardboard for the entire thing makes it just so much more consistent. In the original, I used whatever cardboard I could find and it had different thicknesses and different ways of bending and things, and I think that made it a lot harder. So this one, using the Nespresso pod boxes, has been so much more just like straightforward and easy to work with. So I've taped it all in place and I've got it in roughly the shape that I want. The key difference is going to be that I can put the pods on the inside of the legs, which is what the original inspiration image had. So I'm hoping that that's going to come together. I'm hoping it doesn't look funny. Like, I don't know if it's all going to work. So we'll have to wait and see. And I'm calling it the sister stool. And the reason for that is because they're going to be similar, but not identical. So they're going to be sisters, not twins. So the original stool is living in my living room, having a nice life. And I still do need to add pods to the 2 remaining sides of it, but that's dependent on me literally just drinking more coffee. So we'll get there eventually. With my original stool, I made a TikTok about it and someone commented on it really helpfully actually, warning me that if I didn't use PVA on the surface before I put the plaster down, then over time there's a chance that the plaster could literally just like fall off. And so it's a bit late for the original stool, obviously. Maybe its days are numbered, but with the sister stool, I found out before it was too late. So this time I got PVA and I decided to just paint on a layer of the PVA onto the surface, and then straight after that I put on the plaster. So I wasn't intending on making a part 3 of this video, but I suppose in like a year or 2 I'm going to need to do a follow-up of this like accidental experiment that I've done. We can just do like a health checkup of my stools, which is not something that I was aspiring to do, is to make videos about the condition of my stools, but here we are. So if you are at all feeling as emotionally invested in the lifespan and future of these stools as I am, make sure you subscribe, because I promise I will make an update on these to check in on them and just see how they're going. It might be a year or 2, but it'll be worth it. You know, it's a real experiment. We're gonna learn things. So after that PVA, I put on the plaster, and much like in the original one, I sanded it and redid it a few times. Halfway through this, I discovered a different type of plaster that's this specific extra smooth plaster, and I definitely could tell a difference, and it made this one a lot smoother. So I'll leave a link below to this exact type of one that I used, because it's definitely a better product and definitely what you want for a project like this. So after sanding it and plastering it and getting it to a pretty good condition, to be honest, I left it, I reckon, for about like a month, because I was just trying to collect coffee pods. Like, I didn't want to keep going until I had all of the coffee pods I needed, because that kind of made it difficult with the first stool because I did it in smaller batches, and so like some were half done and some were fully done, and it was just a lot to keep track of. So I just went into coffee drinking mode and left the stool there. But I'm kind of glad that happened, because over time I moved it around a little bit as I'm doing various projects, and actually one of the legs cracked and was very, very wobbly and needed to be repaired. And so I'm glad that that kind of happened in this time, because it was so much easier to fix it than if I had fully finished it. So the reason why I think that this happened, because it only happened on one of the legs, is because I alternated between putting the joint tape vertically and horizontally across the whole thing. And I didn't really think about the fact that it really was helping to provide a bit of structure. So lesson learned is do it vertically, because that way it is holding it down with gravity. Whereas when it goes horizontally, where it doesn't join up is almost like a weakness point where gravity can pull it down, especially as it gets heavier when you put plaster on it. So that's definitely like a mistake I made, so you don't have to. So all I did was get some glue and some joint tape and just let it really stick back together. And it completely worked. It's completely sturdy again and feeling good, looking good. So I've been painting my Nespresso pods. I need to go through and finish them off because they all have little remaining spots where I had my thumb to hold them while I was painting them. Here are my tips that I've been thinking about. The first ones I did with just paint. I ended up mixing some paint with some baking powder to get a thicker and chalkier finish, and I have found that that is making it stick better to this metallic surface. So that's definitely something I recommend. And to make it really easy, getting like a small little pot and just putting the baking powder in there and just going, this is now a baking powder thing. It just saves you having to like decant it into various vessels and make a mess. So I definitely recommend doing it that way. And if you have any left over, you could always put the lid on it and see if it survives. The other things that I'd recommend is making sure you've got all the ones that you need. I've got a lot, and I'm going to be using these to finish off my first stool and then also add to this one that I'm working on now. But doing it in these bigger batches is definitely way better. The first time I did it, I was doing like 5 and then like 6 and just like groups, and there were like some that were half painted, some that had plaster on them, and some that were finished, and it was quite chaotic. Whereas this of just waiting until you've got enough and just doing each phase in bigger batches, and it's easier to keep track of. The other thing that I would recommend is before you start to paint these, dedicate an area to it. Pick out where they're going to be drying. I know that it's so easy when you do these things to be like, oh no, it'll all be fine, but just putting down a space that's cardboard or whatever, so you're not going to make a mess, but to have that space like cleared and ready also helps you move a lot quicker. And then the other thing I really recommend is setting out a pattern. I'm trying to lay them down into rows so that when I want to come back, because I'm quite impatient, I'm probably going to want to do that this afternoon, I can at least come back and start and know the ones that are the most dry, and then progress again with the next layer. So what I'm going to do is 2 layers of paint to like get that base, and then I'll probably do 1 layer of plaster. I don't really know why I didn't figure this out before, but by painting with a thicker paintbrush, and perhaps it's also having the baking powder mixed in, and painting sideways, the paint sort of gathers in those ridges and is smoothing them out. So that's good, because that's really what this exercise is about, is like layering onto the pods so that you can't see the ridges and it looks just like a little dome. I must say, I have found myself really enjoying looking at my other stool. Whenever I look at it, it really brings me joy. I like it. But also what brings me joy, of course, is that I made it, but also that I turned rubbish. Like I used rubbish to make not just make something, but to make something that like looks, I think, really good and like nice, and you know, it's like a treasure. So I'm definitely thinking about more and more things that I can make out of rubbish, because it feels really good to not be wasteful. Like it's sort of marrying up all these things that bring me a lot of joy, which is like, I like not being wasteful, I like being resourceful, I like problem solving, and I like being creative. And so it brings all those things together. I've been working on making these little paper mache bowls. They're in progress. That's out of cardboard. And made the paper mache out of cardboard. Here's another one. They're a work in progress, like, you know, I'm working on it. But yeah, I think I'm gonna make more things out of rubbish. Just gotta work through the ideas that I've got. This is another one of those things where halfway through I have a bit of a brainwave, and I thought, I'm doing so much to these to clear out the ridges so that they don't look like coffee pods. But I realized the material they're made out of is so flimsy, I could literally just press the ridges back out. So I'm a bit annoyed that it took me so long to figure that out, but that was something that I realized only once I was this deep in it. So it was too late for the big batch of pods, but I did have a few remaining, and so I thought I would test it by pushing down the ridges from the inside and then just using paint and seeing how that worked. And visually it did work, and you definitely could get away without using the plaster. However, the layer of plaster onto the pods really did add a lot of strength to them, and I anticipate that if the stool had a little bit of a fall, I think the ones without plaster would probably crumple in, and the ones with plaster might be a bit more robust. So that's something to consider, and look, maybe I'll have an update on that when we do our health checkup on these stools. So I've got the stool here. In the latest layer of plaster that I did, I wiped it on with my hands. I put gloves on and just wiped it over just to try a different technique. And it sort of made it more interesting. It definitely was a lot more like perfect and flat and smooth before, and this isn't. I've just sanded this, so it's a bit smoother, and I smoothed it on the top a little bit, but you can still see the ridges. I think I'm gonna go with this. I'm just feeling like having a different approach to the previous one and just being able to compare what the best approach is. Also the leg that I had to, you know, reconstruct is sturdy now, so that really worked. I think this texture is gonna actually be an interesting alternative to the other one. It'll be interesting when I put the paint on it, how that goes, and if that's it, maybe the paint will make it look worse or better, I don't really know. But I'm just like embracing an alternative thing and like having an experiment. I don't really know why I was concerned about the paint. The paint went on fine and it worked just as well as it did with the original stool. And I actually started upside down. So I tipped it upside down and did all of the areas around the bottom of the stool first. And then once that was dry, I came in and did the sides and the top to finish it off. So once it was dry, it was time for me to add the pods finally. Like the previous stool, I used Gorilla Glue. And as I was doing it, I realized the Gorilla Glue takes so long to dry that you really need to like use the glue, put it in the spot, and then let it sit in that spot for 10 to 15 minutes or however long it takes to really set in place. But I realized that after I've done two sides of the stool, I can't leave it laying on its back anymore because the pods will like crumple in because they're too weak. So I tested using some tape to hold it in place and some various things, and it didn't really work. So I had to come up with a different idea, and I decided to give it a go with a hot glue gun. And this was so much better. I should have done this from the beginning. Like Gorilla Glue is excellent, but hot glue is just so much quicker because you just put it on and stick it there and it sticks immediately. So that also enabled me to do it while the stool was standing vertically, so I could just literally go around the whole thing. Now, one negative to this is I didn't realize that sometimes when you're standing on a different angle, what you think is straight isn't actually straight. So the consequence is that some of my pods are a little bit wonky in their position, and only when I stood back and looked at it properly did I realize that. So that's a bit frustrating. I did go and fix some of them, but I'm kind of embracing it with the rest of them because I feel like if I go in and start pulling off pods and repositioning them, I could do that forever. Like they'll never be perfect. So I'm just learning to have a little bit of patience with that and just letting it be. I have a cordless hot glue gun, and if you are considering buying a hot glue gun, you absolutely have to get a cordless one. It is so much easier and it's actually a lot safer because when you have the cord of a hot glue gun, it's so easy to accidentally knock things over or get tangled, and then you burn yourself and it's a mess and it's a disaster and you ruin something. Whereas the cordless one is so much more agile, especially when you're trying to get around the legs of a stool and all these little things. It's just so much safer and so much easier to use and so much more enjoyable. And what I really like about the one that I have, it's so easy to charge. It has a little light that shows you when it's running out of battery, and you literally just plug in a micro USB cord and just let it charge. I really like that it's just so easy, it's safe, it's just very straightforward, and it works really well. So if you're thinking about getting a hot glue gun, it is absolutely worth getting a cordless one. So I'll leave this exact one linked below because I just really recommend it. So then it was just a case of taking that same paint with a small paintbrush and tidying up the edges of where the pods joined onto the stool. For the most part, this was all that I needed to make it look a lot tidier and smoother. However, there were some where the gap between the pod and the stool was a lot bigger, and I probably should have used some cork. But in all honesty, I just couldn't be bothered to go back to the hardware store. So maybe further down the line, I might do some touch-ups with some cork, because when you look closely, there are some that really do need it. But from far away, it's close enough, and most of them do look perfectly fine. So after a few rounds of touch-ups and waiting for it to dry, finally it's time to show you the finished stool. I'm so happy with it. And actually, I was really questioning the shape of it because it was a different thing to the one that I was copying, and I thought it just looked a bit odd. But I'm really glad I continued with it because I do actually think that this sister stool might be my favourite. When you look at them next to each other, I think that they both look really good in their own way. And I definitely think that having these two complementary items is so much more interesting than if I had just made two identical ones. So yeah, sisters not twins is definitely the way to go. And it really is all coming together in this room. I've got that lamp that I made, I've got the disco balls that I made. Some people might be wondering where the lemon pot has gone, and don't worry, I've still got it. It's just been moved upstairs to a place that is better for that plant to survive. Now, since I've ended up calling this the sister stool, it has occurred to me that should I give this stool to my sister? But in all honesty, even if I could be bothered to arrange shipping all the way to Australia, I don't think this stool could really survive a journey like that. I think it would break. So I think I'm going to keep it for now and just have a pair of them. Now you're probably thinking, why is it overkill to have two stools? They look great, they're complementary, it's a nice little pair. And the reason why is because I'm already thinking about another project. I don't like our fireplace. It's not even a real fireplace, it's just electric, but it doesn't even work. So its days are numbered in this house anyway. And so I've been thinking about things that I could do to have a more interesting fireplace concept. So one of the ideas is to actually replicate this Nespresso pod and plaster concept, because it could make actually a really unique fireplace. But I don't know if I've got the guts to do it, honestly, and I don't know if it's a bit of overkill. I can always move the stools, of course, to a different room if it's too full on, but I'm just not sure. But in the meantime, I am really trying to think of ideas of how I can use rubbish for interesting projects. So if that's something you're interested in too, make sure you subscribe. And if you have any ideas about what I could do with rubbish or what I should do with my fireplace, let me know in the comments below. I'm really, really interested to know if you've got any good ideas.